Welcome back. In the last video, I created the data access layer for the skills, for the group select doll. Looks familiar, where we were selecting the group information from the group stored procedure, passing in an optional group ID. This is passed back to the business logic layer. And this is going to be called from the data access layer calls the business logic layer, and then the business logic layer is going to be called from the presentation layer. And let me keep that one open for now. What I'm going to do in the presentation layer is create a control, and I'm going to call a RAD grid control. If I go to my toolboxes, toolbox is here somewhere. There it is. Okay, and I forgot you could search for this stuff, so instead of having to poke through every single control, RAD grid. The controls all have smart tags, thank goodness. I'm closing a few windows here. If I go to the split view, so I don't have to type in the ASP code manually. You notice when I throw the grid on the control, it does put this run it server tag. I do get a name for the grid, but that's pretty much it. There's a few defaulted things that happen. It gives you automatically or automatically generated columns. I don't want that. Let's go to the smart tag. I'll turn that option off, and I'll go into edit columns. There is sort of a bad news thing with this, is that when you're in it, it is modal, so it doesn't let you bounce out of it. So I know that the column names didn't change from the stored procedure column names, so I'm just going to steal them from here. The first one, group ID, I want as a bound column. I'm not going to do anything with it. I'm not going to edit it. I'm probably going to hide it eventually, but right now I just want it as a bound column. I'll throw the data field in as the data field ID, and the header text, I'm going to call it group ID. I'm going to add another bound column for the next attribute, which is group name. Group name. I may eventually want to make this one editable, but for right now, I'm going to name the header is going to be group name, and the data field is going to be group name. And then participation level ID. This is probably going to be a drop down eventually, but for right now, it's going to be a bound column. Again, the data. And there is literally a million options you can use, and you'll see some of them later on, but I'm just going to make this one simple. Participation level ID. Okay, you notice that it painted my three columns. I could have, if I wanted to, type these in manually, typed all this code in manual, but the smart tag allows me to do that in a much easier way, I think. At least I know what's going on behind the scenes. Let's close the middle tier projects and open up the presentation project, open up the code behind for manage org, where this control is going to sit. And I already had, I typed this in while it was on pause, but let me tell you what I did. I'm instantiating a new instance of the BLL class as a private variable in the code behind, so this BLL can be used anywhere, the instance of BLL. And I'm calling, and this is just for argument's sake, I'm calling list groups with a hard-coded value of 1. Now, obviously, this value would change depending on which group you're selecting. For right now, I'm going to set a value in as 1, and that's going to be the data source. And this method is called needs data source. Let me show you a little trick that is going to save you a million lines, or at least a million cycles in your mind. Let me comment this out. I'll go back to the ASP page. You notice that, let's see, here's RAD grid. Okay, this is going to need there's a method called onNeed data source. This is a Telerik method that's in most of their controls, and what it is it's sensitive. There isn't a data source. So this is what I want to show you. You notice I said equals, and it says create new event. I click enter, and it's going to create the event in the code behind and add the signature in the code behind. All these different methods sometimes use different signatures and are a pain to remember which one is which. So having it add for you automatically is just a really cool feature. I'm going to set the data source as that list groups method, and I'm going to pass over 1. The needs data source, it does one thing behind the scenes. After the data source is set, it binds the grid. So it'll automatically execute the procedure and fill out the data. If you did this, if you said rad grid 1, oh man, I can't type today, data rad grid 1 dot what did my IntelliSense go away? Let's see. Rad grid 1 dot, there we go, data bound. If I let, this is the method that usually says bind the data to my grid. If I do this in the needs data source, it'll throw me an error. That this sort of happens behind the scenes. So let's see what happens when we run it. I'm going to take off all my breakpoints. I don't know if I have any breakpoints. I'll disable them. I expect to see a grid with a couple of columns and one line of data. That's what should happen. I set my page start as this page just so I don't have to go through, you know, like a maze of pages to get to things, to get to this. Okay, well, it did what I kind of thought it was going to do, but it gave me both groups. Probably the store procedure, it's not coded for this right. My column headers, group ID, group name, participation level ID. I have 1 and 2. If I go to the store procedure, what am I doing with this? I'm passing in group ID, and then I'm saying if group ID is null, then do this, else the where clause is coming out. So that's why I got both of those back. So I'll show you how to do, there's a better way of doing this store procedure in one way without having to do check if it's null, and if it's null, add the where clause. Anyway, so we're back here. I've got 2 rows in the grid. This is exactly what I expect to see. Let's go to the back end, and just for grins, I'm going to execute the store procedure insert. And I'm going to give a new test group, group number 3, participation level 3, whatever that means. And we're going to run the insert statement. The insert runs. It's created 3. I got 0 there. I should be able to go back on my web page, hit F5, and build in or bring in that new group, and that new group shows up with 3 with 3. So let's take a look. I know this is like 20 minutes into this video between this and the first one, but take a look at how easy it is to bind data to a grid. I mean, from the presentation side, the work has to be done. In other words, the heavy lifting is in the middle tier projects. The presentation side of it is very light, and this strategy gives you a couple different gets. First of all, the front end doesn't have we have it as done as .NET, but if this was done in Java, you could achieve this same sort of simplicity in any language. It's poor practice to have any SQL or any calls to the data in any other method but a DAL, BAL. Does that make sense? Because we have there's only a few things you need to do. There's only think about this. The only logic you need to have in the presentation layer are things like, what would happen if I selected this row versus this row? Or if I select this, imagine what I expect to see on this group, managed group, is to have group information up top and then another grid down here with participant information, or maybe a nested grid. So if a tree grid. So if I click this, it opens up the list of people in that organization. Those are things you have to handle on the presentation end. But binding it to the data and pulling the data itself doesn't belong here. It makes the coding a lot easier, and it correctly separates the separation of concerns between layers. Excellent. We're going to get into a little bit more the complex part of the RAD grid and the RAD controls. In other words, how do I edit a RAD grid? Editing is not too difficult. Let me give you a really quick one. Let's say if I go and bring up the smart tag for the RAD grid again. Okay, it's having a problem finding silk. Don't worry about that. We'll go back to that one. Silk is the skin for the grid. We'll go over that. So let's say I want let's see, a button column. I want to see button column. Cool. And text I want to show is delete. And I want that button column to be the first column in the grid. this is positional. So in other words, where they sit is where they show in the grid. So the first column, second column, third column, fourth column. So I'll now have a button in my grid in the first column. Delete. It's not doing anything right now, but I didn't wire up the back end of it, but it's that easy to put buttons. It's another column. So if I wanted a drop down is a little trickier. A drop down you have to do what's called a template column. Real quick, I'll go back to the grid. If we go back to the smart tag, the different columns that I can add for a grid, one of them is a template column. A template column says is a column that will behave differently depending on the state of the grid. So the grid right now, when you see it in the state that I just showed you, it's like the browse option. You can have a grid in edit. In other words, I click the edit button and the row in the data behaves a certain way. Or I can have it in edit so the whole grid is in edit. We'll talk about, and I'll show you what that looks like. As far as the other options, it's very flexible in the CSS that you can apply to it, the styles. You can really go crazy with this. The best way to do it, honestly, with grids is to pick a skin, and this is one of the errors it was giving me was the skins. It looks like I need to bring in this one doesn't have the right skins as part of the assembly, but the Telerik gives you, I think, about a dozen different themes. A skin is like a theme, if you could think of it like that. If I go to my references, it does have skins there. I'll fix that, and I'll make sure it's posted. But what you should be able to do is look here, go to skins, and pick the correct skin that you want. Let's go to the default skin. I guess I'm just not importing it correctly. Okay. So if I look down here, this little rendering error is because it doesn't see the silk skin. Yeah. So I'll figure out what's going on with the skins and have that fixed, and I'll post that fix. Excellent. This code is posted. Manage org. And what I'm going to do now is probably come up with a framework of the next few screens that we're going to have. A lot of the stored procedures are done, at least for the regular entities. We're going to finish up the stored procedures in the back end for things like joining a volunteer to a group, deleting a volunteer from a group. We'll get all those straight, and then once the back end is completely done, we can really start to put together the grids and the complex controls to render that data. Excellent. Thank you very much. Bye.